Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she completed another set of pull-ups at Camp Pendleton. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the training grounds, but she pushed through the discomfort. At 22 years old, she had already proven herself as one of the most dedicated Marines in her unit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the signs of countless hours of rigorous training. The other Marines watched her with a mixture of respect and skepticism. Sarah had joined the Corps 2 years ago with dreams of serving on the front lines, but the reality had been different. Despite her exceptional marksmanship scores and physical fitness ratings that surpassed many of her male counterparts, she found herself assigned to support roles time and again. Martinez, front and center, barked Sergeant Collins, a weathered veteran with 20 years of service under his belt. Sarah jogged over, her boots hitting the dusty ground in perfect rhythm. Collins looked her up and down, his expression unreadable. "Sir, yes, sir," Sarah responded, standing at attention. "We've got word from headquarters about the next deployment to Afghanistan. You're not on the list for frontline duty," Collins said bluntly. "You'll be assigned to the communications unit, providing support from the base." Sarah's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. This was the third time she had been passed over for combat assignments. "With respect, sir, I'd like to know why. My scores are among the highest in the battalion." Collins shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Martinez, you're a fine Marine. But frontline combat is different. It's about more than just scores on paper. The brass thinks you're better suited for support roles." The conversation that followed was one Sarah had heard variations of many times before. Despite the military's official policies about gender integration, the reality on the ground was often different. Many of the senior officers still held traditional views about women in combat, believing that they were a liability rather than an asset. Sarah's journey to this moment had begun in a small town in Texas, where she grew up helping her father at his gun shop. By the time she was 12, she could outshoot most adults who came into the store. Her father, a former Army Ranger, had taught her that precision and discipline were more important than brute strength. He had also instilled in her a deep sense of duty and patriotism. When she announced her intention to join the Marines after high school, her family was supportive, but worried. Her mother, a school teacher, had concerns about the dangers her daughter would face, but Sarah was determined to serve her country in the most meaningful way possible. Boot camp at Parris Island had been challenging, but Sarah thrived under the pressure. She excelled in every area of training, from physical fitness to tactical exercises. Her drill instructors were impressed by her dedication and natural leadership abilities. She graduated third in her class and was selected for additional marksmanship training. At the Marine Corps School of Infantry, Sarah continued to distinguish herself. During one memorable exercise, she scored a perfect 50 out of 50 on the known distance course, hitting targets at ranges up to 500 yards with iron sights. Her instructors called it one of the most impressive displays of shooting they had ever witnessed from a new Marine. But despite these achievements, Sarah found herself facing constant obstacles when it came to combat assignments. The reasons given were always different, but the result was always the same. She was relegated to roles that kept her away from the action she craved. Her fellow Marines had mixed reactions to her situation. Some, like Corporal Jackson, believed she deserved a chance to prove herself in combat. Jackson had served alongside Sarah during training exercises and had seen firsthand her tactical skills and cool demeanor under pressure. "It's not right, Martinez," Jackson told her one evening as they sat in the mess hall. "You're better than half the guys they're sending to the front. Hell, you're better than most of them." But others were less supportive. Lance Corporal Thompson, a vocal critic of women in combat roles, made his feelings known whenever the opportunity arose. "Combat isn't about hitting targets on a range," he would say. "It's about life and death decisions under fire. Women don't have what it takes for that kind of pressure." Sarah rarely responded to such comments directly, but they stung nonetheless. She knew that she would have to work twice as hard as her male counterparts to earn the same opportunities. The frustration was building inside her, but she channeled it into her training, becoming even more focused and determined. One afternoon, during a particularly intense training exercise, Sarah's unit was simulating a patrol in hostile territory. The exercise was designed to test their ability to work together under stress and make quick decisions in dangerous situations. Sarah was assigned to provide overwatch from an elevated position, while her teammates moved through a mock village. As the exercise progressed, several of her teammates made tactical errors that would have been costly in real combat. From her position, Sarah could see threats that they were missing and opportunities they were failing to exploit. She radioed suggestions and warnings, helping to guide the team to a successful completion of the mission. After the exercise, the commanding officer pulled Sarah aside. Captain Reynolds was known for his fairness and had a reputation for evaluating Marines based purely on their performance, rather than any personal biases. "Good work out there, Martinez," he said. "Your situational awareness and communication skills probably saved that mission from being a complete disaster." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, hoping this might finally lead to the opportunity she had been seeking. "I've been watching your progress," Reynolds continued. "Your scores speak for themselves, and I've seen how you perform under pressure. I'm going to put in a recommendation for you to be considered for the next combat deployment." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but Reynolds held up his hand before she could respond. "I want to be honest with you, though. There's going to be resistance from some quarters. Not everyone believes women belong in combat roles, regardless of what the official policy says. You're going to have to be absolutely perfect if you want to change minds." That evening, Sarah called her father to share the news. His voice was filled with pride but also concern. "Mija, you know this won't be easy," he said, using the Spanish term of endearment he had called her since childhood. "But I've never known you to back down from a challenge." As Sarah lay in her bunk that night, she thought about the long road that had brought her to this point. Tomorrow would bring new training, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove herself. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the skills and determination to succeed if given the chance. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in the briefing room with 49 other Marines, listening to Colonel Harrison outline their upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as maps of the Helmand province were projected onto the screen. Sarah's heart raced as she realized she was actually being included in a combat deployment briefing. "This mission is critical to our operations in the region," Colonel Harrison explained, his weathered face serious. "We'll be establishing a forward operating base in a contested area. Intelligence suggests heavy Taliban presence, and we should expect regular contact with enemy forces." Sarah took careful notes, absorbing every detail about their mission. The area they would be operating in was known for its difficult terrain and hostile population. Previous Marine units had faced daily attacks from improvised explosive devices, sniper fire, and coordinated assaults. After the briefing, Captain Reynolds approached Sarah. "Martinez, I want to talk to you privately." They walked to his office, where he closed the door and gestured for her to sit down. "I managed to get you on this deployment," Reynolds said, "but I had to make some compromises. You're going as a designated marksman with 2nd Squad, but you'll also be handling communications equipment. Some of the senior officers wanted guarantees that you wouldn't be in a purely combat role." Sarah felt a mix of gratitude and frustration. It wasn't exactly what she had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. "I understand, sir. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Reynolds replied, "but understand this. Every move you make will be scrutinized. There are people waiting for you to fail, and if you do, it'll make it that much harder for the next woman who wants to serve in combat." The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who would come after her. The next month was spent in intensive pre-deployment training. Sarah worked with 2nd Squad, learning to operate as part of their team. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Williams, was initially skeptical but gradually warmed to her as he saw her dedication and skills. "Martinez brings something different to the table," he admitted to his fellow NCOs one evening. "She's got eyes like a hawk and never misses anything. Plus, she can handle that radio equipment better than anyone else we've got." Not everyone in the squad was as accepting. Private First Class Rodriguez made snide comments about having a woman in their unit, worried that she would slow them down or become a distraction. "This isn't a place for political correctness," he grumbled to anyone who would listen. Sarah heard the comments but chose not to respond directly. Instead, she focused on proving herself through her actions. During training exercises, she consistently demonstrated superior marksmanship and tactical awareness. In one particularly challenging scenario, she spotted and neutralized 3 simulated enemy positions that the rest of the squad had missed. The training culminated in a week-long field exercise that simulated the conditions they would face in Afghanistan. The Marines were required to carry full combat loads while navigating difficult terrain and responding to various threat scenarios. Sarah not only kept up with her male counterparts but often took the lead in identifying potential dangers and suggesting tactical solutions. On the final day of the exercise, disaster struck. During a simulated patrol, Private Rodriguez stepped on what would have been an improvised explosive device in a real combat situation. The exercise called for him to be treated as a casualty with severe leg injuries. As the squad medic worked on Rodriguez, enemy fire began coming from multiple directions. Sarah quickly identified the primary threat, a sniper position on a ridgeline about 400 yards away. The simulated enemy sniper was picking off Marines one by one, and the squad was pinned down behind inadequate cover. Williams, "I can take that sniper," Sarah called out to her squad leader over the sound of blank ammunition and pyrotechnics. "Negative, Martinez. Stay with the radio and call for support," Williams shouted back. But as more Marines were being marked as casualties by the exercise controllers, Sarah realized that waiting for support might mean losing the entire squad. She spotted a flanking route that would put her in position for a clear shot at the sniper position. Without waiting for permission, Sarah low-crawled through a dry creek bed, moving carefully to avoid detection. The simulated enemy fire continued overhead as she worked her way into position. After 20 minutes of careful movement, she reached a spot where she could see the sniper's position clearly. The target was partially concealed behind a rock formation, with only his head and shoulders visible. At 400 yards, it would be a challenging shot even under ideal conditions. But Sarah had been training for moments like this her entire life. She controlled her breathing, adjusted for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The blank ammunition fired, and immediately the exercise controller at the sniper position raised a red flag, indicating that the target had been neutralized. With the sniper threat eliminated, the rest of 2nd Squad was able to advance and complete their objective. When the exercise concluded, the evaluation team gathered all the participants for an after-action review. "Outstanding performance by 2nd Squad," announced Major Peterson, the exercise controller. Particularly noteworthy was the flanking maneuver that eliminated the sniper threat. That was textbook tactical thinking under pressure. Staff Sergeant Williams looked at Sarah with new respect. "That was some impressive shooting, Martinez. And good tactical decision-making." Even Private Rodriguez, despite his earlier skepticism, had to admit that Sarah's actions had saved the mission. "I guess I owe you one," he said quietly as they packed up their gear. That evening, Colonel Harrison visited the training site to observe the final equipment inspection. He pulled Sarah aside for a brief conversation. "I've been getting reports about your performance during this exercise," he said. "Impressive work, Marine." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "I want you to understand something," Harrison continued. "When we get to Afghanistan, the situations you'll face won't be exercises. The bullets will be real and the stakes will be life and death. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah looked the colonel directly in the eyes. "Sir, I've been preparing for this my entire life." "I'm ready." Harrison nodded slowly. "We'll see, Martinez. We'll see." As Sarah cleaned her rifle that night, she reflected on how far she had come. The deployment to Afghanistan would be the ultimate test of everything she had learned and trained for. She knew that the challenges ahead would be greater than anything she had faced in training, but she felt ready to prove that she belonged on the front lines with her fellow Marines. The next morning, the Marines began their final preparations for deployment. Sarah packed her gear carefully, including the specialized optical equipment that would be crucial for her role as designated marksman. As she loaded her sea bag onto the transport truck, she thought about her family back in Texas and the pride in her father's voice when she had called to tell him about the deployment. Soon, she would have the chance to prove that her gender was irrelevant when it came to serving her country and protecting her fellow Marines. The transport plane's engines roared as Sarah and her fellow Marines flew over the Atlantic Ocean, beginning their journey to Afghanistan. The cabin was dimly lit, filled with the quiet conversations of soldiers mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Sarah checked her equipment for the 10th time, ensuring every piece of gear was properly secured and ready for immediate use. Beside her sat Corporal Mike Chen, a machine gunner who had become one of her closest friends during training. Chen had initially been skeptical about serving alongside a woman in combat, but Sarah's performance during exercises had won him over completely. "You nervous?" Chen asked quietly, adjusting his helmet as he tried to find a comfortable position in the cramped seating. Sarah considered the question carefully. Not nervous exactly, more like focused. I know what I trained for, and I'm ready to do the job. The flight to Afghanistan took nearly 18 hours, with refueling stops in Germany and Kuwait. During the layovers, Sarah observed her fellow Marines and noticed the different ways they dealt with pre-deployment stress. Some joked and laughed loudly, others listened to music or wrote letters home, and a few sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts. Staff Sergeant Williams gathered 2nd Squad together during the stop in Kuwait. Listen up, Marines. In a few hours, we'll be boots on the ground in a combat zone. Everything we've trained for becomes real from that moment forward. Stay sharp, watch each other's backs, and remember your training. Sarah absorbed every word, knowing that the next few months would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of other women who wanted to serve in combat roles. When they finally landed at Camp Leatherneck in Helmand Province, the reality of their situation hit immediately. The base was a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and defensive positions. The sound of helicopters was constant, and in the distance they could hear the occasional rumble of artillery fire. The heat was oppressive, even in the early morning hours. Sarah felt sweat beginning to form under her body armor as they were processed through the arrival procedures. The air smelled of dust, diesel fuel, and something else she couldn't quite identify, the distinctive odor of a place where danger was always present. Colonel Harrison briefed the newly arrived Marines about their specific mission. They would be establishing Forward Operating Base Phoenix, a small outpost about 30 miles north of their current location. The area was known for heavy Taliban activity, and previous attempts to establish a permanent presence there had met with fierce resistance. Our job is to deny the enemy freedom of movement in this area, Harrison explained, pointing to a map of the region. Intelligence indicates that this valley is a major supply route for insurgent forces. We cut off that route, and we significantly impact their operations throughout the province. Sarah studied the terrain features on the map, noting the elevated positions that would provide good overwatch for enemy snipers. The valley was narrow with steep ridgelines on both sides, perfect country for ambushes. The convoy to FOB Phoenix departed at dawn 3 days later. Sarah rode in the 3rd vehicle, her designated marksman rifle secured beside her and communications equipment powered up and ready. The landscape they traveled through was both beautiful and ominous, rugged mountains and valleys that had been contested territory for centuries. Eyes open. Everyone, Staff Sergeant Williams reminded the squad through their headsets. This road has seen a lot of IED activity lately. The convoy moved slowly, with mine-resistant vehicles leading the way and scanning for explosive devices. Sarah monitored the radio frequencies, listening for any intelligence updates about potential threats along their route. About halfway to their destination, the lead vehicle called a halt. Sarah could see the convoy commander and his team examining something in the road ahead. Through her rifle scope, she scanned the surrounding hills, looking for any signs of enemy observation or movement. Possible IED ahead, came the radio call. Explosive ordnance disposal team moving forward to investigate. The next hour was tense as the Marines waited while the bomb disposal experts examined the suspicious object. Sarah maintained her overwatch position, sweeping her rifle scope across the ridgelines and looking for anything out of place. Finally, the all-clear signal was given. The object had been a piece of scrap metal, not an explosive device. The convoy resumed its movement, but everyone remained on high alert. When they finally reached the location for FOB Phoenix, Sarah was struck by how exposed and vulnerable the position appeared. It was situated in a small valley, surrounded by higher ground that would provide excellent vantage points for enemy observation and fire. The previous Marine unit had begun constructing defensive positions, but much work remained to be done. Home sweet home, muttered Private Rodriguez as he surveyed their new surroundings. The first week at FOB Phoenix was spent improving the defensive positions and establishing patrol patterns in the surrounding area. Sarah found herself constantly busy, not just with her designated marksman duties, but also managing communications equipment and helping coordinate supply deliveries. The enemy presence in the area became apparent almost immediately. On their second night, mortar rounds began falling inside the perimeter. Sarah grabbed her rifle and raced to her assigned fighting position as the base's defensive systems came online. "Incoming! Incoming!" shouted the Marines on duty as the whistling sound of mortar rounds filled the air. Sarah pressed herself against the sandbags of her position and tried to spot the origin of the incoming fire. Through her night vision equipment, she could see muzzle flashes from a ridgeline about 800 meters to the north. The enemy mortar team was firing from a position that provided them with excellent cover and concealment. "I've got eyes on the mortar position," Sarah reported over the radio. "North ridgeline, approximately 800 meters." Counter-battery fire from the base's own mortars began falling on the enemy position within minutes. The incoming fire stopped, but Sarah continued to watch through her scope, knowing that the enemy would likely try to reposition and attack again. Sure enough, about 30 minutes later, she detected movement on a different part of the ridgeline. "Movement on the east side of the North Ridge," she reported. "Looks like they're trying to set up in a new position." This time, the base's response was immediate and overwhelming. Artillery fire and helicopter gunships converged on the enemy position, ending the threat for the night. After the attack, Captain Reynolds approached Sarah's position. "Good spotting tonight, Martinez. Your observations allowed us to respond effectively." "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied, though she felt a surge of pride at the recognition. Word of her performance that night spread quickly through the small base. Some of the Marines who had been skeptical about her presence began to see her in a new light. She wasn't just a woman trying to prove a point. She was a Marine doing her job competently and professionally. But challenges remained. The enemy continued to probe the base's defenses nightly, and the daytime patrols were becoming increasingly dangerous. Sarah knew that her real test was still coming, and when it arrived, she would need to be ready to prove herself not just as a competent Marine, but as a warrior capable of making life and death decisions under the most extreme pressure. The Afghan landscape was unforgiving, and the enemy was determined to drive the Marines from their newly established outpost. Sarah cleaned her rifle methodically that evening, knowing that her skills and training would soon be put to the ultimate test. 2 weeks into their deployment at Phoebe, Phoenix, Sarah woke to the sound of urgent voices and hurried footsteps outside her tent. The pre-dawn darkness was still thick, but something was clearly wrong. She quickly pulled on her boots and grabbed her rifle, stepping outside to find Marines rushing to their positions. "What's happening?" she asked Corporal Chen, who was adjusting his machine gun on its mount. "Patrol didn't make it back last night," Chen replied grimly. "Third Squad went out yesterday afternoon and missed their scheduled check-in. Command is organizing a search and rescue operation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Third Squad included several Marines she had trained with, good men who had families waiting for them back home. In combat zones, a missed check-in usually meant serious trouble. Staff Sergeant Williams approached, his face grave in the dim light. "Martinez, we're part of the rescue team. Get your gear ready. We move out in 20 minutes. Sarah hurried back to her tent and began assembling her equipment. Her designated marksman rifle was already clean and zeroed, but she double-checked everything: ammunition, optics, communications gear, medical supplies. Every piece of equipment could mean the difference between life and death for the missing Marines. The rescue force consisted of 2 squads plus additional support personnel, including a Navy corpsman and an explosive ordnance disposal specialist. As they gathered for the mission briefing, Sarah could see the tension in everyone's faces. This wasn't a routine patrol. This was Marines going to help other Marines in trouble. Captain Reynolds outlined what they knew. Third Squad was conducting a presence patrol in the village of Kalam Gar, about 6 kilometers northeast of here. Their last radio transmission was at 1800 hours yesterday. A local informant reported hearing gunfire and explosions in that area around 1830. Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the terrain features and potential danger areas along their route. The village was situated in a valley that could easily become a kill zone if the enemy had prepared an ambush. "We'll approach from the west, using the high ground to maintain overwatch while we investigate," Reynolds continued. "Martinez, I want you positioned where you can cover the entire valley. If our people are in trouble, they're going to need precise fire support." The patrol left Fob Phoenix just as the sun was beginning to rise over the mountains. Sarah felt the familiar weight of her equipment and the responsibility that came with her role. As the designated marksman, she would be expected to engage targets at long range while the rest of the patrol maneuvered closer to the objective. The terrain was challenging. Rocky slopes covered with loose shale that made quiet movement almost impossible. Sarah focused on placing each step carefully, maintaining her balance while scanning for potential threats. The morning air was cool, but she knew the temperature would rise quickly once the sun cleared the mountains. After 2 hours of difficult movement, they reached the overwatch position that Captain Reynolds had selected. From this vantage point, Sarah could see the entire village of Kalamgar spread out below. Through her rifle scope, she could make out several buildings that showed signs of battle damage, bullet holes in walls, and what appeared to be blast marks from explosions. "I can see definite signs of fighting down there," she reported, quietly into her radio. "Multiple buildings show fresh damage." As the rest of the patrol began their descent toward the village, Sarah established her shooting position among the rocks. She had excellent fields of fire covering all the likely avenues of approach that an enemy force might use. The patrol's movement toward the village was slow and methodical. Sarah watched through her scope as they bounded from cover to cover, always maintaining security and looking for signs of the missing Marines or enemy activity. Then she saw movement that didn't belong. On a ridgeline about 400 meters south of the village, partially concealed behind a rock outcropping, she detected what appeared to be an enemy observation post. Through her scope, she could see at least 2 figures with what looked like radio equipment. "Possible enemy observation post, South Ridge 400 meters from the village," Sarah transmitted. "2 personnel, appears to be communications equipment." Captain Reynolds' voice came back immediately. "Can you confirm hostile intent?" Sarah adjusted her scope's magnification and studied the position more carefully. One of the figures was clearly speaking into a handheld radio, while the other was using binoculars to watch the approaching patrol. "This was definitely an enemy position coordinating an ambush. Confirmed hostile. They're reporting our patrol's movement." Sarah replied. "Take the shot when ready," Reynolds ordered. Sarah felt her heartbeat slow as she entered the focused state that her father had taught her years ago in his gun shop. Everything else faded away. The sound of insects, the heat of the sun on her back, the voices of other Marines on the radio. Her world narrowed down to the crosshairs of her scope and the target 400 meters away. She controlled her breathing, allowed for the slight crosswind she had noted earlier, and squeezed the trigger smoothly. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through her scope she saw the radio operator collapse. The second enemy fighter immediately began to move, but Sarah had already worked the bolt of her rifle and acquired the new target. Her second shot dropped him before he could reach cover. 2 enemy KIA at the observation post, Sarah reported calmly. With the enemy spotters eliminated, the patrol was able to move more freely toward the village. Sarah continued to provide overwatch, scanning for additional threats while the Marines below investigated the battle site. What they found was worse than anyone had hoped. 3rd Squad had been ambushed while investigating reports of weapons caches in the village. The Taliban had used the narrow streets and flat-roofed buildings to create a complex kill zone, then attacked the Marines from multiple directions simultaneously. The patrol found the bodies of 3 Marines from 3rd Squad, including the squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite the shared name. They had fought bravely but had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and the enemy's knowledge of the terrain. But 4 Marines from 3rd Squad were still unaccounted for, and there were signs that they might have been taken prisoner. Blood trails led away from the main battle site toward a cluster of buildings at the far end of the village. "Martinez, we're going to need you to move to a new position," Captain Reynolds radioed. "We think some of our people might be held in those buildings to the east." Sarah quickly gathered her equipment and began moving to a new overwatch position that would give her coverage of the suspected enemy stronghold. As she moved, she could hear sporadic gunfire from the village below as the patrol encountered pockets of resistance. From her new position, Sarah could see into the courtyard of a large compound, where she spotted armed fighters moving between buildings. More importantly, she could see what appeared to be American equipment and gear piled near one of the structures, clear evidence that captured Marines were being held there. "I have eyes on the target compound," Sarah transmitted. "Multiple enemy personnel, and I can see American equipment in the courtyard." The rescue operation was about to become significantly more complex and dangerous. Sarah knew that the lives of her fellow Marines would depend on her ability to provide accurate, effective fire support during what would undoubtedly be a fierce battle to free the prisoners. She settled into her firing position and began to systematically identify targets and ranges, preparing for what might be the most important shooting of her life. The morning sun was now fully up and the heat was becoming oppressive, but Sarah's focus was absolute. Her fellow Marines were counting on her, and she would not let them down. Sarah adjusted her position behind the rocky outcrop, her rifle steady on its bipod as she watched the compound below through her scope. The Taliban fighters moved with confidence, clearly believing they controlled the situation. She counted at least 8 armed men in the immediate area, with more likely inside the buildings where the captured Marines were being held. Captain Reynolds's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Martinez, we're going to breach the compound from the north wall. I need you to neutralize any threats that could interfere with our assault." "Copy that, sir. I have multiple targets in sight," Sarah replied. Her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Through her scope, she could see the rescue team positioning themselves for the assault. Staff Sergeant Williams was directing the Marines into their attack positions, while the Navy corpsman prepared his medical equipment. Every second counted now. They had no way of knowing what condition the captured Marines were in, or how long they had before the enemy decided to execute their prisoners. Sarah identified her priority targets methodically. 2 Taliban fighters were positioned near what appeared to be the main entrance to the building, where the prisoners were likely held. Another 3 were manning positions that would give them clear shots at the Marines during their approach to the compound. "Beginning engagement," Sarah transmitted. Her first shot took down a Taliban fighter who was positioned behind a low wall with a clear view of the Marines' approach route. The man dropped immediately, never knowing what hit him. The sound of the shot echoed across the valley, and the remaining enemy fighters immediately began looking around for the source of the fire. Sarah had already shifted to her second target, a fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher who could devastate the rescue team if he got the chance to fire. Her second shot dropped him before he could bring his weapon to bear. The Taliban fighters were now fully alert to the sniper threat, but they couldn't locate her position among the rocks. Sarah used their confusion to eliminate a third target, then quickly shifted position as enemy fire began to rake the area where her muzzle flash might have been visible. 3 down. Continuing engagement, she reported as she settled into her new firing position. The rescue team used the distraction Sarah was creating to begin their assault on the compound. She watched through her scope as Marines moved swiftly across the open ground, using the covering fire from her rifle to reach the compound walls without taking casualties. As the assault team prepared to breach the main building, Sarah spotted new movement. A group of Taliban reinforcements was approaching the compound from the east, moving quickly through the narrow streets of the village. If they reached the compound, they would trap the rescue team inside and turn the situation into a desperate siege. "Contact east." "Approximately 12 enemy fighters moving to reinforce the compound," Sarah transmitted urgently. "How far out are they?" Reynolds asked as the breach team prepared their explosive charges. Sarah estimated the distance and speed of the approaching enemy force. 2 minutes, maybe less. The Marines inside the compound were now committed to their assault. Sarah heard the explosions as they breached the building, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire from inside the structure. The rescue was underway, but the approaching reinforcements threatened to turn success into disaster. Sarah made a quick decision. Instead of continuing to provide overwatch for the Marines in the compound, she shifted her attention to the approaching enemy force. If she could slow them down or disrupt their movement, it might buy the rescue team the time they needed to extract the prisoners. The range to the approaching Taliban fighters was nearly 600 meters, a challenging shot under any circumstances, but made more difficult by the fact that the targets were moving quickly through the village streets. Sarah controlled her breathing and led her first target, accounting for his movement and the increased bullet drop at the extended range. Her shot struck the lead Taliban fighter center mass, dropping him instantly. The rest of the group immediately took cover behind buildings and began trying to identify where the sniper fire was. Coming from Sarah worked the bolt of her rifle and acquired her next target, a fighter who was trying to maneuver around the side of a building to get a better angle on the compound. Her second shot caught him as he exposed himself, sending him tumbling to the ground. The Taliban reinforcements were now pinned down by Sarah's accurate fire, unable to advance without exposing themselves to her rifle, but she knew she couldn't hold them indefinitely. Her ammunition supply was limited, and eventually they would find a way to outflank her position. Inside the compound, the rescue operation was reaching its climax. Sarah could hear sustained gunfire, and the occasional explosion as the Marines fought their way through the building where the prisoners were held. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for word on whether their fellow Marines were still alive. "Prisoners secured. 4 Marines alive, 2 wounded but mobile," came the jubilant call from Staff Sergeant Williams. Sarah felt a surge of relief, but she knew the mission wasn't over yet. The rescue team still had to extract from the compound and make it back to friendly territory with their wounded comrades. And the Taliban reinforcements she was holding at bay would certainly try to interfere with the extraction. "Martinez, we need covering fire for our withdrawal," Captain Reynolds transmitted. "Can you keep those reinforcements pinned down for another 10 minutes? Sarah checked her ammunition supply. She had enough rounds remaining, but she would have to make every shot count. "Affirmative, sir. I can hold them." The next few minutes were the longest of Sarah's military career. She methodically engaged any Taliban fighter who attempted to advance toward the compound, while simultaneously coordinating with the extraction team through her radio. The rescued Marines were in rough shape. They had been held captive for nearly 18 hours and showed signs of interrogation and abuse, but they were alive and able to move with assistance. As the rescue team began their withdrawal from the compound, Sarah shifted her focus back to providing overwatch for their movement. The Taliban fighters she had been holding at bay were now trying to flank around to cut off the Marines' escape route. Through her scope, Sarah spotted a Taliban fighter setting up a machine gun position that would allow him to rake the Marines' withdrawal route with deadly fire. The range was over 500 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind a stone wall. But Sarah knew she had to take the shot. She steadied her breathing, calculated the holdover for the long-range shot, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the machine gunner in the upper chest, and he collapsed behind his weapon. The Taliban position fell silent. "Outstanding shot, Martinez," came Chen's voice over the radio. "You just saved our bacon." The extraction continued, with Sarah providing continuous overwatch as the rescue team moved through the village streets toward their rally point. She engaged 3 more Taliban fighters who attempted to set up ambush positions, each shot precisely placed to eliminate the threat without endangering the Marines below. Finally, after what felt like hours but was actually only 23 minutes, the rescue team reached the safety of the overwatch position where Sarah had been providing cover. The 4 rescued Marines were immediately attended to by the Navy corpsmen, while the rest of the team established a defensive perimeter. Captain Reynolds approached Sarah's position, his face showing a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. "Martinez, that was some of the finest marksmanship I've ever witnessed in combat. Your fire support made this entire operation possible." Sarah looked at the rescued Marines being treated by the corpsmen and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These were her brothers in arms, and she had played a crucial role in bringing them home safely. The journey back to Fob Phoenix was tense but uneventful. The Taliban fighters in the area had been sufficiently bloodied by the rescue operation that they chose not to pursue the withdrawing Marines. Sarah maintained rear-guard security as they moved, but her rifle remained silent for the remainder of the mission. When they finally reached the safety of the forward operating base, word of Sarah's performance during the rescue operation spread quickly. The Marines she had helped save were effusive in their praise, crediting her precision shooting with saving their lives and making the rescue possible. That evening, as Sarah cleaned her rifle in preparation for the next day's operations, Staff Sergeant Williams approached her. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When I first heard we were getting a woman in our squad, I had my doubts. I figured you'd be more of a liability than an asset. Today proved me wrong in every possible way." Similar conversations took place throughout the base as Marines who had previously questioned Sarah's presence in a combat role found themselves forced to reconsider their positions. She had proven beyond any doubt that her gender was irrelevant when it came to performing under fire and protecting her fellow Marines. The rescued Marines made full recoveries, and the intelligence they provided about Taliban operations in the area proved invaluable for future missions. More importantly, their rescue demonstrated the effectiveness of the integrated combat teams that included female Marines in combat roles. 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, Sarah stood at attention in the dress blue uniform that every Marine wore with pride. The ceremony at Marine Corps Base Quantico was packed with fellow Marines, family members, and military officials. Her parents had flown in from Texas, and her father's eyes gleamed with unmistakable pride as he watched his daughter receive recognition for her service. The Commandant of the Marine Corps himself was presenting the awards that day. Sarah had been promoted to sergeant and was receiving commendation for her role in developing new training protocols for integrated combat units. But more importantly to her, she was seeing the results of the barriers she had helped break down. Standing beside her were 3 other female Marines who had recently completed combat training. They represented the new generation of women who would serve in frontline roles, benefiting from the precedent that Sarah and others like her had established. The military had officially opened all combat positions to women, and these Marines would face fewer of the obstacles that Sarah had encountered. The integration of women into combat roles has proven successful beyond our initial projections, the Commandant announced to the assembled crowd. Marines like Sergeant Martinez have demonstrated that competence and courage know no gender boundaries. They have earned their place through performance, not politics. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young female recruit who was preparing to enter Marine Corps training. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you," the recruit said nervously. "I've read about what you did in Afghanistan. It gives me hope that I can serve the way I've always dreamed of." Sarah smiled, remembering her own doubts and struggles during training. "Just focus on being the best Marine you can be. Everything else will take care of itself." The conversation reminded Sarah of how much had changed since her deployment. The rescue mission that had seemed like just another day's work at the time had become a turning point in military policy and perception. The successful integration of women into combat roles was no longer theoretical. It was proven fact, demonstrated under the most demanding circumstances possible. Later that evening, Sarah attended a reunion dinner with the Marines from her squad in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Williams, now a gunnery sergeant, raised his glass for a toast. To the Marines who didn't make it home, and to the ones who did because Sarah Martinez could shoot straight when it mattered most, he said solemnly. The dinner was filled with war stories and updates on everyone's current assignments. Corporal Chen had been accepted into officer candidate school and would soon be commissioned as a second lieutenant. Private Rodriguez, who had initially opposed having women in combat roles, had become one of the strongest advocates for integrated training after witnessing Sarah's performance firsthand. "You changed a lot of minds over there, Martinez," Rodriguez told her during the dinner. "Mine included. I was wrong about women in combat, and I'm man enough to admit it." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but she was more interested in looking forward than backward. The Marine Corps was continuing to evolve, and she wanted to be part of that evolution. She had been accepted into the designated marksman instructor course and would soon be training the next generation of Marine snipers and designated marksmen, both male and female. The training role appealed to Sarah because it allowed her to pass on not just technical skills, but also the mental toughness and tactical thinking that had served her so well in Afghanistan. She knew that future conflicts would require Marines who could adapt to changing circumstances and make split-second decisions under pressure. 1 year later, Sarah found herself back at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, but this time as an instructor rather than a student. She was running an advanced marksmanship course for Marines preparing for deployment to various trouble spots around the world. Her reputation as both a skilled marksman and combat veteran made her one of the most sought-after instructors in the Marine. Of course, the students in her current class included 12 Marines, 6 men and 6 women. The gender balance would have been unthinkable when Sarah first joined the Corps, but now it seemed natural and unremarkable. The female Marines trained alongside their male counterparts without special accommodation or lowered standards, just as Sarah had always believed it should be. During one particularly challenging training exercise, Sarah watched as Lance Corporal Jennifer Kim, a young Marine from California, made a difficult 600-meter shot in windy conditions. The precision and confidence Kim displayed reminded Sarah of herself at that age, determined to prove that she belonged and willing to work harder than anyone else to earn respect. "Outstanding shot, Kim," Sarah called out. "But remember, in combat, you won't get a second chance if you miss. Every shot has to count," Kim nodded seriously. "Yes, Sergeant. I understand." Sarah smiled to herself, remembering similar conversations with her own instructors years earlier. The cycle was continuing, with each generation building on the achievements of those who came before them. As the training exercise concluded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The young woman who had been repeatedly denied combat assignments had become a decorated combat veteran and was now training the Marines who would fight tomorrow's battles. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been overcome through performance rather than protest, through competence rather than complaints. Sarah had proven that the only qualifications that mattered in combat were skill, courage, and dedication to the mission and to fellow Marines. That evening, Sarah received a phone call from her father back in Texas. His voice was warm with pride as he shared news that the local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about his daughter's military service. "They want to call you a hero, Mija," he said, using the affectionate term he had called her since childhood. Sarah considered the label. She had never thought of herself as a hero, just as a Marine doing her job the best way she knew how. The real heroes in her mind were the Marines who hadn't made it home from Afghanistan, and the ones who continued to serve in dangerous places around the world. "I was just a Marine doing my job, Papa," she replied, no different from anyone else. But even as she said the words, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. She had been different, not because she was better or worse than other Marines, but because she had been fighting multiple battles simultaneously, against the enemy abroad and against prejudice at home. Now, as she looked at the new generation of Marines training under her instruction, Sarah realized that her greatest victory hadn't been any particular shot she had made in Afghanistan. Her greatest victory was that the young women training to be Marines today would never have to fight the same battles she had faced. They would be judged solely on their performance as Marines, which was exactly as it should be. Sarah Martinez had helped ensure that future generations of women would have the opportunity to serve their country in any capacity their skills and dedication warranted. The transformation was complete, and it had been accomplished one precise shot at a time.